Here's a look at the cap after an initial pass with the 1500 grit micro mesh. As you can see, it's not very shiny. I started by sanding the cap ring area and the very edge of the cap so that it wouldn't get distorted or scratched. I could preserve the groove much more easily if I wasn't sanding completely over it all the time. I also covered the clip to protect it against being scratched by the abrasives in the micro mesh. So I'm going to polish this with ever finer micro mesh, and that's it. And here it is. After the restoration work is complete, here's the cap. The polishing is done, all the way down to the finest grit and a final coating of wax. And the clip has been polished with semi-chrome and given a final coating of Her Majesty's metal burnisher. And it's ready to be attached to the rest of the pen. There were a couple of minor flaws that remained. The issue with some of the cracks that were visible are still there. You can still see them a little bit, not very well in this light because we have such strong sunlight, but they've been fairly well polished out, but they're still somewhat visible, and that's just the inherent flaws in the material, but they're not really bad looking. They blend in rather nicely. So the cap is all finished. And now it's time to put everything that I've worked on all together. All the pieces that you've seen me work on in the previous videos. The lever and the retaining ring. The pressure bar that compresses the sack. The barrel that you saw me work on and polish. Here's the section and the new sack that I've installed. The cleaned up feed and the polished nib that you probably remember was pretty pitted and corroded around the base, but which I worked on until I got it to a nice clean polish. And of course the cap, which you've seen me work on the most recently, minus of course the band that I broke. So all the components are here, and it's time to put it together and see if I have a functioning Majestic fountain pen. Here it is, all finished and ready to go. The completed Majestic, assembled and ready to go. Everything's polished and cleaned up and freshly in place. The clear translucent section, you remember when I got it, it was completely caked with ink on the inside. Now you can see through it, nice and clean. The nib is as clean as I can get it. It's the original nib, but it looks like it's going to be in good shape. The feed is clean. The lever works. It's hard to test with these gloves, but trust me, it works. And we're ready to see if it will take some ink and write. So here is the dip test of the Majestic. I'm going to use my favorite ink Conway Stewart Brown, which is soon to be extinct. I have a bottle and a half left because they don't make it anymore. So I'm going to open it up and just do a simple dip test. I'm not going to try the filler out at this point. I just want to test the nib to make sure that it's attached pretty decently. So I'm going to dip the nib just enough to get it inked for the first time in a very, very long time. And we're going to see just how well it writes. Hello world. Obviously not a lot of ink there, but I'm back. I filled the sack off camera because it was just a little too complicated to show with the camera in front of me. But I had some very healthy bubble action, some happy slurping sounds, which is a really good sign. So let's see what it writes like when I've got a sack at least partly full of ink. This is a test. It writes nice and smooth. The nib is just a little bit scratchy, but not too bad. I could probably stand with a little adjustment. As you can see, it's a very nice, rather expressive nib. If I put a little force on it, it gives me a little expression. Makes a little bit of a scratching sound, but nothing out of the ordinary. There's really good contact between the base of the nib and the feed, which ensures a good ink flow. You really need that. Sometimes when you put a nib in, there might be a little bit of gap between the top of the feed and the bottom of the nib. And when that happens, the ink can't flow through capillary action down to the tip. So when you're inserting the nib feed combination, always make sure that those two are in contact firmly when the seating is complete. Something to point out there. I made sure of that before the test, and once again, it picks up really nicely, as you can see. And I'm going to say that my new Majestic works like a charm. Thank you all for hanging in there during the restoration process. I hope you enjoyed it. It was a pleasure showing it to you. I have to say that it didn't really take 4 months to do it. This is a hobby that I do in my spare time. I could probably have done this all in a weekend, but getting it spread out like this gave me the opportunity to show you in great detail. And I have to point out how cool it is that the clear section now has ink in it once again. So this is a living, breathing pen, and it's going to have a new lease on life. It's at least 100 years old, and with a little luck, it might last another 100. And I'll see you on my next restoration project.